So, just to pick up where you left off, I think our task at this stage, and in this context, Peter, is not so much to decide what should be in or out of an agreement. What we are doing here is running an analytical process for the next, nine months, 12 months or whatnot. And so in a way, operationally, the issue before us is, I think, centrally, what research papers on what topics should we commission from whom? And these will be the subject of discussion in the planned 2 future symposia. There could be other discussion opportunities as well that we could wire into this project. And the idea would be that they would provide the foundation for chapters that go into a published volume at the end of the project. So we're really at a kind of a research planning stage here, if you will. And we'll have some offline discussion ourselves about this. But I think while we have some important colleagues in the room, it might be useful to get some feedback on that with the benefit of the discussion today. So let me, for purposes of trying to sharpen that or focus that discussion, let me lay out a few possible areas in which we would commission some research just to get the discussion rolling here. So obviously one is tariffs. We need a tariff chapter of a report which corresponds to a tariff chapter of an agreement. We had a very good piece of analysis laid on the table by Gary and Ji-sun, and you also in your report have treated this as well, but we clearly need to go deeper on that. That's an obvious one. Second are NTBs, and I don't really know whether this should be disaggregated or not, but local content, green subsidies, procurement are variously referred to as non-tariff barriers, or the subsidies, the positive or affirmative subsidies you could put in a subsidies chapter. Thirdly, standards, technical standards, very important. I personally feel this is the trade facilitation aspect of this is a crucial dimension. Fourth, services, and we've heard a good suggestion by Tim at the end there that there has already been very good work done by this Friends of Energy Services group in identifying a list as a point of departure. Next is a question mark, Amy's suggestion, which partially overlaps with some of what I've just already listed on the investment side. Moreover, I think we need something that looks at the legal options, MFN or not, WTO or not. And then very importantly, I think we need a couple of pieces here on the impact. And I'd like to deconstruct that a bit. I think the traditional thing in a trade policy project is you do an economic analysis. How much will this affect trade? What sectors? What are the tertiary effects potentially? I don't think that's sufficient in this case. I think it's necessary, but not sufficient. So we certainly should do some macroeconomic analysis, and Peter, you have encouraged this all along, as I recall. But I think in addition, the following, given the political context and the environmental context for this exercise, we need a couple of other pieces of work. One is I do think it would be beneficial to take a look and try to model or project, estimate, whatever word we feel comfortable using here, what the impact of something like this would be for improving access to energy. Because the renewables revolution, when it arrives, one of the interesting benefits of this is that it will enable this distributed energy model, which has really large significance for those people who do not have energy currently. And I think it would be wise for a project like this, which is trying to inform policymakers of both the technical challenges but also the opportunities, if we got a sense of the contours of the opportunity for developing country constituents who do not now have access to energy. That's one. Number two, I think we need an environmental, or you might call a mitigation case for this, because this is not just an economic conversation. This is, as Ricardo has emphasized in his remarks, one of the most important calling cards for this exercise is that it will enable faster progress toward the environmental objectives that have been set in the climate area and potentially others. So anyway, that's my not so short list perhaps of possible areas for research inquiry and potentially papers. They can be sort of shuffled around, combined in some different ways, but that's what I think I see potentially as the next step for discussion among the three institutes here, Gary and Ricardo and me in particular. And it would be very helpful to get any initial reactions to that, and in particular if you have some suggestions of people who you think might be very good to ask to conduct some of this research, keeping in mind that we're looking for a balance of rigor, but also we want to get some geographic diversity into the universe of researchers. So let me throw that open to my colleagues, but also particularly to you while we have you here.
I just jump in and say that from a purely sort of nuts and bolts practical standpoint, where we are now, the next 3 to 6 months, we will continue to see, I think, trade cases that get brought up. You can continue to see friction on these issues. A number of these domestic content rules have been in place for several years without anybody complaining very much because it didn't matter that much, and now it's going to start to matter a lot. So in the short term, here and now, it strikes me this is not part of a policy-making process, but this is part of actually trying to influence the discussions that will go on around this. And I think Peter's point about doing an economic analysis, something that shows fairly quickly just how much you could hamper the deployment of clean energy through any number of these different disputes, how we are moving in the right direction and how things could very easily get hung up and really drive us off course from trying to address climate change, and something that fundamentally gets at that's economically oriented. To me, that's not a long-term plan, but getting to this question that was mentioned earlier about what's useful and what's not in the WTO, I can tell you honestly, and I would certainly welcome Shale's perspective on this as well, which is that just about everything about the existing trade dispute process as we've seen it play out so far has been basically irrelevant to the clean energy sector as it operates today, because things move way, way faster in our industry than they do in any part, the negotiated part or the settlement part, whatever part it is, it's too slow. And companies will be gone, long gone, by the time some of these things get resolved. So I would say something that focuses very much on the next 6 months and really does try and highlight why it is so important to not allow these disputes to flare up and really drive this industry off course.
Rick, I would have just a couple of elaborations on your very good outline and maybe one additional question. The elaborations are fairly obvious, but just to put them on the table, in the analysis of tariffs, NTBs, and all the different impediments, we want to be sure that the analysis is sufficiently disaggregated by country or region to make sure that it provides guidance to the key players. And you focused, and rightly so, on the benefits to developing countries that don't now have energy, and that's a very important consideration, but the basic decisions are still going to be made by the big guys. Gary and Jeff did this famous or infamous study for us of the quantitative payoff from the Doha Round package that's on the table. That had a big impact, in part because it demonstrated to certain countries that there wasn't much in it for them. And so we want to be sure to address that dimension, hopefully with sufficiently robust numbers that will attract countries and say there isn't a lot in it for us, but we have to find out, and so that's got to be done at the country and or regional level. On the institutional questions, legal as you put it, I think there is an issue which you Ricardo implied an answer in his presentation, and he's probably right, but it's whether this agreement would be a standalone agreement or done in a broader context, like a renewed Doha Round. There are a lot of efforts around the world to think up creative ways to reinvigorate the Doha Round. My guess is that's flogging a dead horse, and better to go off on a new tangent. But there are a lot of people that don't have that in mind, and so a lot of right-minded people who would see this as a good idea would say, aha, here's a way to get the Doha Round back on track. So a key question for a group with the interests of this agreement is whether that would muck it up so badly time-wise at least, but maybe even substantive cross-issue linkage as to be avoided at all costs. One of the reasons the ITA succeeded was that it did come in the post-Uruguay round era and was a standalone agreement. It was not linked to anything else. And so I would think that's the way to go, but I think the issue ought to be addressed specifically. And then my final, it's really a question, and Ethan implied something on that, is timing. We've talked about this before, but I don't recall that we have an agreed sort of timetable for bringing all this to conclusion. So you've said over the next year, and that's probably about right. From a very narrow US-centric point of view, we're going to have, we may have a new administration a year from now, and or a new Congress. That will, as always, generate thinking what should be the program for the new administration, particularly if there is a new president, after a president who, to put it mildly, was not overly ambitious in the trade area. Go back to an administration which, at least its predecessors, were more ambitious, particularly this time around with a more congenial Congress. So you might conceivably have a new opportunity for US engagement in trade policy initiatives in that political circumstance. And so I would think we might want to get this done in time to position for that. Whether that new administration would be equally energetic on climate change issues is a question. So you might take with one hand, give with the other. On the other hand, we should be creative in trying to think about that possibly new political circumstance here, and so try to bring the project to its conclusions, its package proposals, its game plan, sort of by the end of next year.
Certainly, I think. Amy?
Actually, about the Doha Round, I think we may be saved because the terms of reference to the Doha Round and the Doha Declaration, you know, every round is preceded by years of wrangling about the scope of the round. And remember, anything that wasn't in the Punta Declaration couldn't be in the final act. Well, basically, I think you may be saved because, you know, the Doha Round, the Doha Declaration is a finite scope, and certain things were left out of it on purpose. And it may be that the scope of what you all want to do wouldn't fit within the scope of the Doha Declaration, in which case you've got to be outside. There's no way that someone could basically sentence you to be on a train headed to nowhere.
Yeah, but Amy, as you know, it may be a renewed Doha, which is not viewed as a continuation of the old Doha. It may have new terms of reference and all that. That's what I meant. And even. But even in your case, the Punta Declaration did not envisage creation of WTO, which came into the Uruguay round negotiations later on. So I mean, there are ways to do it. I mean, you may be right, but ingenuity is widespread. So I would just be aware of that possible sidetrack.
Ricardo?
So just very quickly to follow on that and then make some other comments, but on the Doha or the WTO going forward issue, I think and I see that there's some sort of emerging consensus there that the only possibility is to think about how to flank the current terms of reference of Doha with activity that derives both from the mandates in the pre-existing agreement as well as new mandates, something like that. So it sounds all for the moment very abstract, but basically if you think of it as a sort of a three-track train, if you like, right? You have on one hand all these Uruguay round committees and councils and so on that have prescriptions that can be used and mandates that can be used to move some issues. Some of those include issues on energy and climate change and so on, like the CTE, and countries are already trying that. So Singapore has brought in the question of BCAs now, and they have a program to start bringing in more issues related to climate change. in that discussion. And then on the other sort of extreme of that, so the third track, you have the possibilities that could be provided to the WTO by the ministerial conference, for instance, and that could come also from outside, so other type of ad hoc arrangements and so on. And then you have Doha, and I think that the solution moving forward for the WTO is to try to combine sort of activity there where Doha might be the dormant track. But that's a bigger discussion. But back to some of the suggestions of going forward. The first thing is that what we've learned in the past few years working on this issue is that the dynamism in the industry is such, and in the technologies, that keeping up with it is very hard, and keeping up with also the dynamism in the markets. So we keep sort of running after all these developments and changes in comparative advantages, changes in different, well, in policy environments and so on, which I think calls for an approach to moving this forward that includes not only the research that has to be done, but also dialogues and consultations in a very intensive manner. There are strategic opportunities that are coming up that I think that we can seize to try to move things forward. The UNFCCC platform is one, and around that, but also next year is the UN Year of Access to Energy, and the 2012. So there will be a number of again, activities and so on, and governments will be forced to look into these questions of access particularly. And then there's this Rio Plus 20, and again, if we try to position some of these discussions within that political context, there may be an opportunity to get something like a conversation going that goes beyond the people that are more informed and that have been thinking about these issues. But I think that we also need to stage policy dialogues in a consultation that goes sort of beyond what we had discussed before with Rick, of these 3 dialogues that we have already programmed, and try to think about the key actors. So we need, I was last week, spent 2 weeks in China, and it's clear to me that we need to organize activity in Beijing, probably also in Taipei, and in a few countries that are key players in all this, in that region. Similarly in Latin America. And so again, we need to think about how to structure some sort of policy dialogues program that can help us move forward. Then just very quickly on the issues for research, I think that the list that Rick just gave is a good list. We have been preparing some of the research that goes into a number of these areas already. One that I think is very important because it sort of preempts the questions that come from the skeptics particularly, is the issue of legal options. We need to have a paper out there that says all these options here would be possible following this kind of pathways. And so that there's no sort of at the outset, no rejection because people think that, well, this is crazy, but how can you do this, that, whatever. And just lay out all the possibilities and then investigate all the legal options that are possible there. And then we need to think about other issues that keep coming up in the mind of developing countries that are not convinced again of moving on these questions. Like, I think if we can have a better understanding of value chains that are involved in different types of technologies, and then again the involvement and the opportunities for developing countries, do a bit of value chain analysis, try to combine that with the impact analysis that Rick's talking about, I think that we can get more buy-in. So what I'm saying, and there are a number of other areas where we can think about in a more strategic manner, so that we can address the kind of concerns and the kind of arguments that could be used to start some movement on these issues. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, which I said before in my presentation, is that what is clear in any discussion that you have on this is that different people have different motivations, obviously, to move these things forward. And the key, I think, is to try to understand which is the one that could move, at least from the government's perspective, more governments. So is it a trade agreement, and then do we pursue this as such, or is it really an energy or a climate change or an environmental pursue? And that changes things. Now, for instance, I'm a bit surprised, but I don't know why that happened, that we don't have too many people here from the environmental community. But my guess is that from conversations that we've had in the past with some of them, including here in Washington, that just to talk about a sustainable energy trade agreement puts them off. If you then go into the subject and explains to them what you're talking about, then, oh, okay, this is interesting, right? But because of, again, the kind of almost automatic reaction that there is to trade right now, this is something that we probably need to address. I think we need to work more with those people. We need to understand if the motivation comes from this question of responding to the access issue, or to the mitigation issue, or to rather developmental and commercial interest, or what is it, and then where to put the emphasis.
Okay.
There's one question over, two questions over here. Go ahead.
services, but also the ETS market is for 80% made up of services. So it's necessary to identify specific services, specifically energy services, and the EU has already submitted a proposal to the WTO, which for reclassifying in energy services or environmental services. And at ICSD we will also work on identifying specific services. And the APEC meeting on Hawaii, it's taking place this week, and the main issue is that the US will push China for accepting a deal on environmental goods and services. And even if China doesn't give into that, then it will be a helpful push for the SETA. And I would take pleasure in disagreeing with the cost for once, because in my opinion, I think that energy security is the overriding motivation for countries to get into clean energy. Of course, it differs per country, but for most countries, I think it's energy security is the most important issue. For example, if you look at the U.S. Army is a champion, big champion for clean energy development, and the reason is literally security. If you look in Afghanistan, the main target of roadside bombs is trucks that drop around fuel in the country. So, and also if you see that in 2005, 40% of all oil production was available for exports, but if you look on, if the current trend continues, only 20% of oil production will be available for export to OECD countries. So the amount of oil that can be exported to the OECD countries will halve in 20 years, 15 years.
Okay, well, thank you, thanks for those thoughts.
On a happy note,
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of research has been done on happiness, and they've been looking for what is the happiest country in the world, and it's Peter's country, it's the best country, it's Denmark. And if you look why is Denmark the happiest country in the world, it's because Danish people reflection. We are now in the US, and the US is a country of foundation of unlimited opportunities. I think for SETA, we need both approaches. We need both modest expectations about the future, and I think Gary gave a very wise advice about starting with a small set of goods, a small list of goods, and but to have a clear point on the horizon and to get implications in the long term.
One other comment over here.
Very
Two other
quickly, because I know we have to wrap. From a political economy and substantive perspective, I think what we heard from Peter and Tim is clearly the business community, we need to engage them much more, and there's not an easy way in right now, and there are not a lot of them really engaged on the trade side from the clean energy perspective. The American Council on Renewable Energy, which I work on, we have an international committee. It's a very small group of the membership. So I'd like to offer two things. One, at the World Climate Summit in Durban, I talked to Ricardo about potentially raising this there, having a forum there to talk to the businesses who already be there, who are coming at it from the climate and clean energy business perspective, but can then have the trade conversation as we're talking about finance and tech transfer in that context. So offer to create a small session there for you guys to take this, move it forward towards Rio. Also was thinking politically to move this forward, wrapping it in that 2012 Sustainable Energy for All. It gets you the energy efficiency, renewable energy, and energy access pieces all in one. It obviously doesn't address kind of clean fossil natural gas, but it's that broader, how do we help move these clean technologies forward and use that to say, and here's one tool we can use to help get us to those 2030 targets within that UN commitment. So, and just offer to help provide some access into the, at least the American renewables industry, which can be a bit tough given the trade associations and other voices. Thanks.
Thanks. I just wanted to mention that in Efficacy we have discussed one more piece of research that could be part of this project. And that would be to look at transfer of technology and how a SETA could contribute to transfer of technology. And I think that could be an important part of the project if we want to generate an interest in some developing countries, in particular Brazil, because I know from discussions we've had with Brazil that that's a key concern for them.
Okay.
Just one last thing. Okay, one last thing, which is actually comes from that, which is transit. Transit is a great subject. It's under-regulated in the WTO. It's a life or death issue for any country that has it as an issue, and especially with energy.
I think the discussion here clearly illustrates all the needs in international rulemaking, which we are faced with from the industry side here. My only consideration here, or concern rather, is listening to the long list that Rick listed up here for research and further work and further discussion, which I think is very relevant. But my consideration is whether we should also consider a parallel track in this process, which will be looking for what would be a very, very focused, limited, simplistic, proposal going forward. And I think especially of timing here, and I agree with Ethan that we have a political opportunity here because of the two panels which are out here. I'm sure there would be a lot of people very willing to opt out of this with such a limited proposal like this. Maybe that could be resolved partly by that. The other thing is I fully agree that in the broader pitching of this, we also need to consider the argument, as you mentioned, access to energy. I mean, you heard in my presentation, it's about cost of energy. But it's not only to Africa, it's also to this country here and to Europe. It's about getting price of renewables down, which is a general benefit for all societies. So that's a very strong driver, and that fits into the energy security debate also. And certainly we should not, forget that climate mitigation is still something that concerns a lot of rulemakers around the world. And I think for a possible new administration in the US, they can, if not see the mitigation potential, then they can see the industry potential in this industry here, which certainly is big.
Just one word complimenting Peter, because he's made this point before, and I think we didn't talk about it here. It is that a natural constituency in terms of countries for these efforts is the non-oil producers. So so the relief on import bills that comes from, again, shifting into renewable energies should be a big incentive for those countries to be interested in this issue.
Final substantive comment. I think we need a sexier name. SETA, I mean, it doesn't really sing. And ITA didn't, well, it was easier to say. It wasn't very sexy either, but Doha Round was a killer. Uruguay Round was almost a killer. People always used to say to Carla Hills, when she was USTR, congressmen used to say, not Bacchus, but Congress used to say, why are you spending all your time negotiating with that little country? So if some of the wordsmiths in the room could come up with a better name, a better acronym in particular that would sing, that would ring, that would be good. I commend that to everybody. But it's time, they have a candidate. What's, what is it? Well, that's better. That's better. It's moving in the right direction. Still doesn't pronounce anything, but it's better. But keep thinking. That's good. How about trade agreement on greens, TAG? Well, you can come up with lots of variants. In any event, we're past our witching hour, but I want to call the session to a halt. Thank all of you for coming. Particularly thank Rick and Ricardo for their pioneering work on this very important topic. Thanks to you for bringing us in at the Peterson Institute. We're delighted to do it and to contribute and continue working with you going forward. Thanks very much to Peter for inspiring and supporting much of this work. This is an initial session of a series of at least 3. I suspect it will be more over time. I would urge everyone to keep thinking hard about all the different aspects of this that we've identified and try to move the ball forward over fairly lengthy but nevertheless defined period of time to try to tee this up for action. Rick, you want to have a final word?
Only simply to thank you and Gary in particular and IIE for hosting us, or PIIE I should say, in this decade. Very much appreciated and look forward to working with you. And if any of you have any afterthoughts, specifically about the research agenda and who might be good candidates to help us conduct some of this research, please do not hesitate to send those suggestions our way. Many thanks.
Thank you to all. Meeting adjourned.